I always believed my father was my protector. For years, I held on to the thought that he was my guardian. Fathers, I assumed, were meant to embody that role: a shield, a mentor, someone who loves you unconditionally without limitations or demands. At least, that's what I kept telling myself every time I looked at him. The truth, as I saw it, was that he'd always be there for me, standing between me and life's harshest blows. My mother was my foundation. Her presence was magnetic. Every space she entered seemed to light up. When she was gone, it was like the entire world turned hollow, devouring everything I thought I knew. And just when I thought life had taken all it could, my father managed to shatter me even further. What I discovered was far darker than I could have ever anticipated. Over time, the person I trusted most became the one I dreaded seeing each morning. The change wasn't sudden. It crept in slowly, like a storm gathering in the distance, with each day ushering in a heavier weight of emotions I couldn't quite name. This is my story, one of betrayal, resilience, and ultimately finding my voice in a world that seemed determined to silence it. My name is Valerie Warner. Growing up, my life seemed ordinary: mundane joys, predictable routines, and the kind of comfort you never realize you'll miss until it's no longer there. My mom, Claire, was the heartbeat of our family. She was the kind of person who remembered all the little things: what made you laugh, what brought you to tears. To me, she was my refuge. Dad, Jackson, had a quieter strength, but he wasn't cold. Mom's laugh, though, was something else. It could brighten even the darkest moments. It was like a warm meal on your worst day. Life wasn't perfect. Whose is? But we had our moments, like Sunday movie nights, crammed together on the couch, losing track of time. Mom's popcorn was always slightly burnt, yet somehow still delicious. Dad would sit beside her, his arm draped casually over her shoulders. Looking back now, I realize how fragile those moments were. My mom's illness wasn't sudden like the dramatic stories you see on TV. It was slow, cruel, and unrelenting. Watching her slip away over the months felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no saving her. I was 16, yet in many ways I was forced to grow up overnight. I tried to stay strong for her, for us. But when she passed, something inside me shattered. The world felt colder, emptier, like a light had been extinguished, and I couldn't figure out how to bring it back. Dad changed, too. At first, I thought it was grief. Losing the person you've built a life with can break anyone. He stopped working regularly, stayed home more, and grew quieter. His hugs became tighter, lingering as though he were clinging to the last remnants of something he couldn't bear to lose. At the time, it seemed almost tender, even comforting. I thought we were leaning on each other to survive the darkest days of our lives. But grief doesn't always unite people. Sometimes it distorts them. As days turned into weeks, I began noticing cracks in the version of my father I'd always known. He wasn't just withdrawn. He was different. His eyes lingered too long, and his touch started to feel wrong. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted the voice inside me telling me something was off. But at 16, grieving alone, it was easier to silence that voice than to face what it was warning me about. So I convinced myself I was imagining it. I wanted so desperately to believe he was protecting me, just like I'd always thought he would. One evening, we were sitting in the living room. It used to be a space that felt alive and comforting, but now it felt hollow, like an empty shell. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching it. The house was unbearably quiet, amplifying every tiny sound: the creak of the couch, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustling leaves outside. Then he spoke. His voice was low, almost soft, and I turned to face him. "You look so much like her," he said. People often told me I had my mom's eyes and smile, but hearing it from him made my stomach twist. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple gesture, one that could have been innocent in a different context, but it didn't feel innocent. His hand lingered and a knot tightened in my chest. I wanted to move, to say something, but I was frozen. My body and mind disconnected, leaving me paralyzed. "You're so beautiful," he said. Panic hit me like a wave as his hand moved lower, brushing across my chest. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, disbelief clouding everything. This was my father. This couldn't be real. Finally, I managed to stammer, "Dad." "What are you doing?" My voice trembled, barely audible. The room seemed to spin around me, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out everything else. But instead of answering, he pressed a finger to his lips, silently urging me to stay quiet as he moved closer. My body resisted my instinct to scream and push him away. The following moments passed in a blur, as though every muscle had frozen in paralyzing fear. Above all, I recall the silence, not his, as he murmured incomprehensible words, but mine. I didn't scream. I remember being dragged to the floor, his weight pinning me down, the sharp pain, and the tears streaming uncontrollably down my face. I didn't fight back. I just lay there. When it was over, he stood up and walked away, leaving me on the floor, tears soaking into the carpet beneath me. But the worst part wasn't the physical pain or the betrayal. It was the guilt. A small, insidious voice whispered that somehow I had caused this, though I didn't know how. After that night, I stayed in my room for a week, unable to face the world. The walls felt suffocating, yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. Hours blurred together as I lay motionless, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How had this happened? Why had this happened? Why hadn't I stopped it? My dad's concerned calls through the door went unanswered. I skipped meals and buried myself under layers of blankets as if hiding could erase the past. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that moment, the memories looping endlessly. The outside world felt foreign, hostile, and overwhelming. On the sixth day, Valerie knocked on my door. Her voice was softer than usual, and her words tightened the ache in my chest. It's him. I wanted to shout at her to go away, but I stayed silent, hoping she would assume I wasn't there. I understand you're upset, she said gently, but we need to talk about this. Her words stung like a slap, especially when she added, we're all we have now. I felt a wave of nausea, and though anger surged, doubt crept in. Was she right? Was I overreacting? Could I have done something differently? With my mother gone, it was just the two of us, and eventually, I let him in. He sat on the edge of my bed, his face a mix of emotions, guilt, sadness, or something else I couldn't identify. Part of me craved answers, any explanation that might make sense of what had happened. I'm sorry if I hurt you, he whispered, reaching for my hand. I pulled away. He invoked memories of my mom, weaving her into his words like a shield. You're so much like her, he murmured. Sometimes I forget. I just miss her. His apology felt hollow, and I wanted to believe it would never happen again. But 2 weeks later, it did. This time he approached me while I was washing dishes. Let's watch a movie, he suggested, his tone light and cheerful, though it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to refuse, to find an excuse, but I couldn't stop myself from following him to the living room. I told myself it would be okay, that he wouldn't cross any lines, and that I could leave if I felt unsafe. But then his hand found my leg, and the cycle began anew. This time, his touches were slower, almost calculated, as if he wanted to ease me into accepting this new reality. When it was over, he looked at me with what seemed like affection and said, next time I'll be more careful. He spoke as though this was normal, as though we simply needed to adjust. His words echoed in my mind, twisting my guilt into something darker. Maybe I was to blame. Maybe I had allowed this. Maybe I owed him something he claimed to need. But the shame made me sick, and I remained silent. I threw myself into schoolwork and avoided friends, teachers, and anyone who might ask questions I wasn't prepared to answer. At home, the quiet dinners and his lingering gazes became unbearable. I thought about telling someone, my best friend, a counselor, even a stranger. But fear always held me back. What if they didn't believe me? What if they blamed me? What if speaking up destroyed the fragile remnants of my family? As weeks turned into months, the incidents became less frequent, but no less painful. Each time, he apologized, his voice heavy with guilt and promises to change. And each time, I rationalized it, convincing myself that his grief had broken him, that it wasn't as bad as it felt. But deep down, I knew it wasn't right. His apologies didn't heal the wounds, and his promises felt empty. I was the sole thread holding him together. It was twisted, but with no one else around, I began to believe him. Still, it didn't erase the revulsion that washed over me every time he touched me. Over time, my urge to fight back, to scream and escape, dulled, replaced by a resigned numbness. It seemed easier this way. Resistance only seemed to make things worse. On a darker level, I clung to his attention. It wasn't love. It was a warped, wretched form of connection that slightly dulled the sting of loneliness. Then Elle Moss entered the picture. She was lively, brimming with energy, and had a laugh that could brighten any space. When my dad introduced her as his girlfriend, I felt an odd mix of relief and jealousy. Relief because I hoped he'd redirect his focus to her and leave me alone. Yet jealousy stirred, a sick, shameful sensation I couldn't fully understand. Was I envious of her? Of the idea that she could offer him something I couldn't? Or was it anger, knowing he could pretend to be normal with her while I suffocated in the chaos he had created? For a few months, life quieted. The nights he would creep into my room stopped, and I felt like I could finally exhale. I poured myself into school, attempting to reconstruct some semblance of a life, but that fragile peace was shattered one night when I returned home early from a study group. I walked into the living room to find Elle sitting far too close to me on the couch, her hand resting on my thigh while my dad watched. "You're so beautiful," she murmured, her voice dripping with sweetness. My stomach churned. My dad didn't intervene. If anything, he seemed to encourage her. That night, the boundaries I thought had been reestablished were obliterated. Elle joined him in the abuse, her presence amplifying the surreal horror of it all. She would smile and whisper hollow reassurances I didn't want to hear, her touch as unwelcome as his. It felt like drowning all over again. The betrayal cut deeper this time because it wasn't just him, it was her too. Worse, he saw nothing wrong with it. "We're family," he'd say. "No one else could understand us." I reached my breaking point one night. Trembling with anger and desperation, I confronted him. "I don't want this anymore," I said, wiping tears from my face. For a moment, he looked surprised as I forced the words out before losing my composure. "I don't want her here. She's making everything worse." "You're jealous," he accused, as though I'd wronged him by expressing my pain. Yet, to my astonishment, a week later, Elle was gone. "You don't want to share me," he said. "I'm not jealous," I replied, my voice shaky but resolute. "I just want this to stop." His response chilled me. In a tone that was both soft and disturbingly proud, he said, "I couldn't bear the thought of making you unhappy." His words twisted themselves into a mockery of comfort, a perverse affirmation that I still had some semblance of control. But the relief was short-lived. His touches became more frequent, his justifications more convoluted. "People wouldn't understand," he said one night, his hand brushing my back. "But that's okay. We don't need anyone else." I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't a replacement for my mother. But the words lodged in my throat, suffocated by guilt and fear. It was as though I were trapped in a cage with no exit, the walls pressing closer the more I tried to comprehend it. Over time, it all faded into the background noise of my existence. I stopped questioning it. Facing the full weight of what was happening felt unbearable. University was supposed to be my escape, a fresh start where I could rediscover myself. I fought hard to stay close to home, as my dad insisted, but even a short distance felt like freedom. The campus buzzed with life, filled with new faces, opportunities, and the hope of a future unbound by my past. I immersed myself in my studies, using textbooks and lectures as a distraction from the wreckage I had left behind. But no matter how far I ran, the weight of my secret trailed me. I flinched at casual touches, shied away from friendly gestures, and avoided letting anyone too close. Trust felt like an alien concept, something I couldn't grasp. Then I met Samra Gillespie. We were assigned to the same history project group. She was everything I wasn't: bright, confident, and effortlessly kind. Just being around her hurt, as though her light exposed the shadows I carried. At first, I kept my distance. It felt safer that way. But Samra wouldn't let me retreat. She had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel seen and valued. One day after class, she said, "We're in the same group. Let's grab coffee and brainstorm." Her smile made my heart race. Our discussion about the project turned into hours of conversation. She talked about her family, her love of photography, and her dream of traveling the world. For the first time in what felt like forever, I opened up, just a little, and told her about my mom. I find joy in reading about how university felt like a lifeline to her. Her narrative was filled with excitement and grand aspirations, while mine was carefully curated to omit the parts I couldn't bear to speak aloud. Over the ensuing weeks, we started spending more time together. something I clung to desperately at first. It wasn't intentional. She had invited me to lunch or asked me to join her for study sessions, which later blossomed into late-night conversations. But being around her was unlike anything before. It felt like stepping into sunlight after years of hiding in the shadows. For the first time, I felt truly seen, and it overwhelmed me. Every time I thought about telling her everything, revealing the hidden parts of my life that I had kept secret from everyone else, I felt a tightening in my chest. What if she saw me differently? Or worse, what if she rejected me completely? How could I defend the things I had done and allowed to happen? So, one evening when Sam invited me to join her, I kept my walls up, even though I felt them slowly breaking down with each of her smiles. I went to her dorm to watch a movie. It felt significant, yet simple and casual. We laughed at the absurdity of the movie while sitting side by side on her bed, a bowl of popcorn between us. At one point, our hands brushed, and I felt a rush of tension. She clearly noticed, but instead of pulling away, she placed her hand over mine and said, "You're safe." Her words had a deep effect on me. I longed to trust her and let go, to bask in the sense of security she offered, but the fear was too loud, too overpowering. So I excused myself to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, tears welling in my eyes. I yearned for normalcy, the ability to hold her hand without being paralyzed by the weight of my past. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living caught between two worlds. The part of me still bound by my father's control, and the part that craved connection, that longed to be with Samara. They couldn't coexist, and I had to end it. That evening, when I sat down with my father for the first meaningful conversation we had in months, my hands trembled, my throat dry, but I forced the words out. "Dad, it has to stop. I can't live like this anymore. We can't continue this way." "You don't mean that, Valerie," he said, his voice low, almost pleading, his face a mixture of disbelief and what seemed like betrayal. "You understand that we're all we have," I replied, my voice growing stronger. "I mean it. I can't live like this. It's not right, and it's not acceptable." For a moment, he seemed like he might argue, but then nodded and said in a quiet tone, "If that's what you want, I'll stop." I wanted to believe him, though I didn't trust him. Deep down, I had a gut feeling. Days turned into weeks, and despite his promise, his presence still loomed over every part of my life like an ever-present shadow. Every time he looked at me, spoke to me, or passed my room, I felt that familiar knot in my stomach. I wanted to trust him, I really did, but the past had shown me that his promises were fragile, so why would this time be different? Meanwhile, Samara remained my anchor. Even on the hardest days, she had a way of making me feel like I could breathe again. One day, in a soft yet piercing voice, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something too heavy to bear alone?" I hesitated, gripping the grass beneath me. I wanted to tell her everything, but every time I tried to speak, fear choked me. What if she thought differently of me? What if she hated me more? What if my dad ended up in jail if she reported it? Eventually, I answered in a barely audible whisper. She didn't press me for more. She simply nodded and placed her hand over mine, silently reminding me that she was always there. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I struggled with the thought that no matter what my father had done, I wanted to believe that Samara would understand. But how could I explain something so convoluted, so twisted, as I lay staring at the ceiling, mentally replaying the conversation, so far removed from anything she had ever imagined?